everybody, I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is First Amendment attorney Jeff Lewis. Jeff, thank you so much for joining me again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
There has been an update in the case we were talking about last week involving Rudy Giuliani. He was ordered to pay $148 million in damages to two Georgia election workers. Before we get into it, are you surprised by this number?
Not really. The plaintiff's attorney had pretty much free reign to make whatever arguments they wanted because of that big discovery sanction against Mr. Giuliani. So I'm not surprised. It's a big number, but I'm not surprised.
When we talked last week, we were talking about a number that was more in the neighborhood of $43 million. So now when you're looking at $148 million, I mean, it's just an eye-popping number. When I heard it, I thought I misread it at first. I thought I added a 1 in front of the 48 there. But do you think that the punishment fits the crime?
Well, obviously, the jury found that Mr. Giuliani's conduct was intentional and willful, and that's why they tagged on additional punitive damages. And it's very consistent with the jury's finding and the seriousness of the conduct, which not only affects these two women, but kind of the nation in terms of how they look at elections and election workers.
Do you think that this sets a precedent for elections to come then?
Absolutely. In terms of how media companies think about what kind of opinions they put on TV and on radio, it will absolutely impact their willingness to put certain extreme views on the TV and radio and the internet. On the other hand, I don't think it's going to have any kind of chilling effect on individual politicians or lawyers who speak on TV. But media companies will take pause.
You're the expert here. You're a First Amendment lawyer. So when it comes to this trial, to this verdict, what stands out to you?
Well, the most amazing and surprising part of the trial didn't happen in the trial. It happened the night after the first day, where Mr. Giuliani took a press conference and said he has no regrets. Everything he said was true. And wait and see what his testimony is going to be. And then he never testified.
I want to talk about that a little more because that really was stunning to go out there and he was doubling down, and not only doubling down, saying he had no remorse. Do you think that factored into the jury's decision at all, or could it even factor into their decision?
It absolutely, I'm sure his lack of remorse will factor in, or did factor in, because one of the findings they had to make was a certain level of intentionality. And remorse. If he had said he was sorry, if he had said he would had regrets, if he said he never would have done it, yeah, maybe the jury could have gone a little softer on the punitive damages, but they hammered him.
I do want to talk about Rudy Giuliani as a figure. I mean, over 20 years ago, he was really revered. I'm in New York City. He was America's mayor. He really had this reputation after 9/11. He was on the cover of Time, and then obviously, things did take a turn over the past 2 decades, and his attorney asked the jurors to remember him, who he was in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, and the attorney reportedly said, quote, "This is a man who did great things. If he hasn't been so great lately, I want you to judge him by the entire character of who he is." Is who he is, or who he was 20 years ago, matter to who he is now?
Interesting. By the way, I remember when he came on Saturday Night Live right after 9/11 and said, "Is it okay for us to be funny again?" I mean, he really helped us transition from a time of sadness to a little bit of normalcy. And I don't think that that argument of focusing in on his entire career was entirely legally relevant. The focus should be on the harm to these two women and their careers and their lives, not the entirety of Mr. Giuliani's conduct, but what he said once he became Trump's lawyer.
So in the eyes of the law, let's say you're an upstanding citizen 2 decades ago, now you do something defamatory. That really doesn't matter, right?
It's absolutely irrelevant. It's the plaintiff's character that's at issue, and their reputation, the harm to their reputation that's at issue, not the character or reputation or history of the defendant.
I do want to now pivot to the financial responsibility on Mr. Giuliani now. His lawyer said that this high of a payout is, quote, the civil equivalent of the death penalty, and it will, quote, be the end of Mr. Giuliani. What happens if he's unable to pay that $148 million?
Well, this judgment's going to haunt him for the rest of his life. He could try to declare bankruptcy, but the intentionality finding and the punitive damages will probably foreclose any kind of discharge. So he's not going to be able to get this debt discharged in bankruptcy. It will haunt him for the rest of his life, and maybe even his heirs will have to be dealing with this debt after his death.
And what happens with the two plaintiffs? Will they ever see a cent of this money?
I don't think so. You remember a fellow by the name of O.J. Simpson who had a multi-million-dollar verdict against him for civil wrongful death? He hasn't paid much of his judgment. And more recently, Alex Jones, he's in bankruptcy. He's negotiating a deal, but he hasn't really paid anything. Lawyers can drag these things out for years. I would expect in this case they're going to file an appeal. And after the appeal, Mr. Giuliani will try bankruptcy. And after bankruptcy, he'll hide his money. And I doubt these two women will see anything significant anytime soon.
I want to talk about this just generally because as just a regular citizen, it's kind of confusing to me. So there's $148 million that you're supposed to pay. Can you go on a payment plan? What does that look like if you have to pay that out?
Well, typically a creditor will be very aggressive and record liens against any real property you have, garnish any wages you have. If he's got a podcast and he gets advertising revenue, they'll try to get at that money. Typically, unless there's a settlement agreement, plaintiff's attorneys don't work on payment plans.
Got it. And he's facing other legal troubles over his actions regarding the 2020 election. Will this verdict impact those future legal battles?
Well, yeah, in two ways. First of all, can you imagine trying to hire a lawyer when you don't have any money and you have a big judgment against you? I can't imagine any lawyer is going to be lining up to represent him in the criminal and civil cases he's facing. So that's one way. And then the second way is, the trier of fact will learn about this verdict, and it will impact, it'll be a lens in which they view the current charges, whether it's the criminal charges or civil charges that he's facing.
And Jeff, can you talk to us about what's happening next when it comes to appeals or anything like that?
Well, first step is they have an opportunity, these lawyers for Giuliani, to ask the trial judge to act as a buffer between the jury and the judgment and try to reduce the dollar amount. So that'll be their first pitch to the trial judge. The trial judge will then enter judgment, and then there will be an appeal. And most states and jurisdictions, and I believe Washington, D.C. is the same, requires that a party post a bond to stay execution on appeal, meaning Mr. Giuliani would have to come up with over $100 million in assets to satisfy a surety or an insurance company to post a bond for him so that the appeal can proceed without any seizing of his assets. And then once the appeal is done, and I expect Mr. Giuliani will lose this appeal, he'll move on to the bankruptcy phase where he'll try to relitigate the question of whether there was a willful and malicious injury. The jury's finding of punitive damages pretty much forecloses that question, but I expect Mr. Giuliani to file for bankruptcy. And then from there, it'll be the hide-and-seek phase where Mr. Giuliani hides assets and the creditor's attorneys try to find him.
Did his statements outside of the courthouse that you and I have touched on multiple times now, him saying, of course I was right, not showing remorse, will that affect the appeals phase?
I don't think it'll affect the appeal one bit. It will affect the bankruptcy, because when the bankruptcy court is looking at whether this was more like a negligent or reckless statement, or was it an intentional and willful injury to these two women, I think that statement on the courthouse steps will come back to haunt Mr. Giuliani.
There's a lot of steps left to look out for, and it seems like this will be tied up in court for a while. How long do these phases typically last?
An appeal can last anywhere between 1 and 3 years, depending on how long the lawyers drag it out. The bankruptcy process, 1 to 2 years, and then the hide-and-seek phase will last for the rest of Mr. Giuliani's life.
And then once Mr. Giuliani does pass away, does this now become his children or his heirs? Is this their problem now?
Only to the extent he has assets, or his estate has assets that the creditors claim are being passed on to his heirs. If he dies penniless and there's no credible claim that the heirs have received any money, the judgment will die with him. But if he has any revenue streams or assets that survive his death and that his heirs try to claim, you could bet the creditors will say, hey, hang on a second, and they'd like to get a piece of that.
Jeff, is there anything else missing from the conversation that you want to add with your expertise here?
It was a strange decision to allow Mr. Giuliani to make those statements promising he was going to testify and show the jury the real story, and then he never did. I don't know if this was a case of lack of client control or bad strategy, but that decision to let him speak to the press will be one that everyone will remember for a long time to come.
First Amendment attorney Jeff Lewis, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.